And we're back to Isaiah and his prophecies. And over the next few days, we'll be reading prophecies from Isaiah to the nations, um, 15 chapters to be precise. So we have 15 chapters of prophecies from Isaiah to the nations. He starts with Babylon. And this is before the kingdom of Judah fell to them. In chapter 3, God referred to them as my sanctified ones. Now, this was because God set them apart to use them as a long-term plan to bless his people through discipline and then restoration. So they will take them and, take them into captivity, be God's sort of tool for discipline, and then also God's tool for restoration. Now, even though God used their sins to accomplish his plans, he eventually punishes their sin. That's the Assyrian sin, the Babylonian sins as well. This demonstrates God's sovereignty. So, to be honest, sometimes when we see like the evil flourishing or things that seem unfair, just know that God has a plan for everyone involved. Babylon was the capital of the ancient nation of Babylonia, but it represents the ruling powers of the world. So I'm sure, as you've heard it said, I know that there's been arguments. Some people say, oh, Babylon is this country, is that country. But even in the book of Revelation, when it speaks about Babylon, because obviously Babylon was long destroyed at the time, it is speaking about ruling whatever countries have the ruling power. So go figure. They will be defeated and destroyed in the end and offer themselves as tribute to the restored people of the Lord, according to the prophecy. In 14:12 to 21, Isaiah was speaking about the kingdom of Babylon, but also in parallel about Satan, due to pride in the context of this passage. Now, that was a period where he said, you'll be thrown down from your his son of the morning, Lucifer. Even in some Bibles, it will tell you Lucifer, but then it was figurative, but then it was also sort of like a parallel. And that's one thing we'll come to know about prophecy. Sometimes it's like parallel. It's never really one thing, or the thing that was being spoken about then, it could also be parallel to something else in the future. Learning a lot about prophecy, reading this book. Next up, Assyria. Now, these ones would destroy Israel and also attack Judah. God will bring his judgment on them, breaking the yoke they placed on his people. Then Philistia is judged. They had been a major threat to Israel from the time they first settled in the Promised Land. Remember, they were a major thorn in Israel's side. Isaiah prophesied that God's promise of protection was only to his people. So even though they may seem to have reprieve from their revolt against Assyria at the time, only God's people had refuge in him. The proclamation against Moab was lengthy. God repeatedly mourned over the destruction of Moab, and I believe that that's because they actually are related. Remember that they're descendants of Lot. So these are people that ordinarily should be part of God's people, but they were so, far gone. This was because the inhabitants were the descendants of Lot, making them distant relatives of the Israelites. And remember Ruth. Ruth was David's grandmother, and she was a Moabitess as well. Pride and arrogance were associated with Moab's fall to Assyria, and the people would mourn with sackcloth and ashes over their destruction and eventually seek refuge in Judah. The last oracle in today's reading was for Damascus, the capital of Syria. Isaiah prophesied that there will be a ruined heap. But God also said that there will be a remnant here, which was kind of odd because they are a pagan nation. They are not part of God's people. So why then should he, have a remnant there? But Damascus was a country or a city that had a common border with Israel. And Ephraim, that's with Ephraim, which is the northern border, the northern border of Israel. And Ephraim had inadvertently merged with them with their practices and, intermarrying, etc. Remember the coalition between Syria and Assyria, Syria and Israel and how they tried to force Judah to join them in that alliance against Assyria. Well, they were united in receiving condemnation because of that, and God also reserved a remnant in Damascus as a result, because some of them were God's people. So here's my hashtag getting to know God lesson. God is tender-hearted, even towards those who are not his people, just like I have said. He mourned over Moab in 16:19 and said, I will drench you with my tears. God showed compassion even to the nations that rejected him. And that's how God is today, even to us, even to those of us who reject him or who rejected him in the past. He still showed compassion and drew us closer to him. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll continue with Isaiah's prophecies tomorrow, and I look forward to sharing my lessons with you. Have a great day. Bye.